Blackwood Lake was a hidden gem, nestled deep in the heart of the American wilderness, surrounded by dense, towering trees that seemed to reach endlessly into the sky. It was a place untouched by time, where the air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a loon. The lake was a favorite spot for campers, a place to escape the hustle and bustle of the city, connect with nature, and to find peace in the solitude of the great outdoors. But Blackwood Lake had a dark history, one that the rangers and the locals were careful not to speak of around visitors. They knew that the land held secrets, terrible, ancient secrets that were best left buried. It was late October when a group of friends decided to spend a long weekend camping at Blackwood Lake. The group consisted of 4 people: Jake, the ringleader with a love for adventure; Sarah, his girlfriend, who was always up for a challenge; Mike, the joker of the group; and Emily, who had a knack for sensing things that others couldn't. They had heard of the lake's beauty and were excited to spend their days hiking, fishing, and sitting around the campfire under the stars. The first night was uneventful, filled with laughter and stories shared around the fire. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on the second night, the atmosphere around the camp began to change. The wind picked up, carrying with it a biting chill, and the trees seemed to close in around them. The group huddled closer to the fire, their laughter fading as an uneasy silence settled over the campsite. Emily was the first to notice it, the feeling that they were being watched. It was subtle at first, just a prickle at the back of her neck, but it grew stronger, more insistent, until she could no longer ignore it. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the darkened forest, but saw nothing, just shadows. "Did you guys hear that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others looked at her, puzzled. "Hear what?" Jake asked. "I don't know. It sounded like someone crying," Emily replied, her eyes wide and fearful. Mike chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "You're just freaking yourself out, Em. Probably just an animal or something." But Emily wasn't convinced. The sound had been faint, almost imperceptible, but it had sent a chill down her spine. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it, but the feeling of being watched persisted. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped further, and the fire's warmth seemed to do little to stave off the cold. The group decided to turn in, retreating to the relative safety of their tents. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the usual nighttime chorus of crickets and owls replaced by an oppressive silence. Emily lay in her sleeping bag, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over her. Every rustle of the leaves outside, every creak of the branches made her jump. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to sleep. Sleep wouldn't come. Then she heard it, the crying. It was louder now, closer, as if someone was just outside her tent, weeping softly. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and she slowly reached for the flashlight by her side. With trembling hands, she flicked it on, casting a beam of light around the small space. Sound continued, unrelenting, and it seemed to be moving, circling the tent. Gathering her courage, Emily unzipped the tent and shone the flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, revealing nothing but trees and shadows, but the crying persisted, louder and more desperate now, echoing through the forest. It was a woman's voice, and it was filled with sorrow and pain. "Who's there?" Emily called out, her voice shaking. There was no response, just the sound of crying, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The others were awake now, peering out of their tents, their faces pale with fear. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. "Yeah," Mike whispered. "We need to leave, now." But as they began to pack up their gear, the crying stopped, replaced by a new sound, a low, guttural growl that sent a wave of terror through the group. The air grew colder still, and the shadows around the camp seemed to move, shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. Friends froze, their eyes darting around the campsite, searching for the source of the sound. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. A woman, or what looked like a woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair hung in wet, matted strands around her face. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits, and her mouth was twisted into a grimace of agony. She glided toward them, her feet not touching the ground, her arms outstretched as if reaching for something, or someone. The group backed away in terror, but the woman kept coming, Her eyes locked onto Emily. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice a rasping, hollow echo. "Please help me." Emily felt a cold hand brush against her arm, and she screamed, stumbling backward. Flashlight slipped from her grasp, and the world plunged into darkness. The last thing she saw was the woman's face, twisted in pain and rage, before everything went black. When the Rangers found them the next morning, they were huddled together by the ashes of the campfire, their faces pale and drawn. Their gear was scattered around the campsite, as if they had fled in a panic. They were alive, but barely, shaken to the core by the horrors they had witnessed. The Rangers knew better than to ask questions. They had seen the signs before, heard the stories of the ghostly woman who haunted Blackwood Lake. She was a remnant of the past, a spirit doomed to wander the woods in search of help that would never come. The friends never spoke of that night again, and they never returned to Blackwood Lake. But the memory of the woman's hollow eyes and her desperate cries stayed with them, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurked in the heart of the wilderness. And they weren't the only ones. Others who ventured to Blackwood Lake would hear the same crying, feel the same cold, and know that they were never truly alone in those woods.